A millionaire on the brink of death bought a pregnant woman who was being sold by her own husband and gave her shelter in his home. The next day, when he was about to die without having anyone to leave his inheritance to, what she did left him in tears. The noise of raised voices echoed through the small wooden house, mixing with the sound of rain hitting the zinc roof. Susan, a 28-year-old woman with long brown hair and dark green eyes, sat on the only sofa in the living room, her hands trembling over her enormously swollen belly. Her faded blue dress barely covered her 7-month pregnant belly, and each movement of the baby inside her seemed a cruel reminder that she would soon be a mother, but might not have a home to offer her child. Tears silently ran down her thin face as she tried not to listen to the harsh words coming from the front door. "Please, God, give me strength to endure what's coming," she thought, closing her eyes tightly. Michael, a 32-year-old man, tall and thin, with stubble and worn clothes, gestured nervously in front of 2 burly men blocking the entrance to the house. His eyes showed signs of extreme fatigue and the pressure he faced. His hands, calloused from so much work in construction, trembled as he tried to find words that could save his family from complete ruin. The loan sharks showed no patience, and the deadline they had given was approaching with the speed of a runaway train. "Listen, I have a proposal that might interest you. Just give me a few more hours to sort this out," said Michael, his voice heavy with desperation. The larger of the 2 men, with a scar on his face and arms crossed, shook his head negatively as he consulted a crumpled paper in his hands. The rain had increased in intensity, and the drops coming through the door were wetting the cement floor of the small living room. Michael knew there was no more time, no more conventional options, and the $15,000 debt seemed like an impossible mountain to climb for someone who earned little money. The cruel mathematics of poverty offered no easy way out, and he felt the weight of responsibility crushing his shoulders like a gigantic stone. "Michael, you've had 3 months to get the money. Tomorrow morning, if we don't have our cash, there will be serious consequences for you all," threatened the man, his voice cold as ice. Susan could hear every word, even trying to cover her ears, and felt the baby moving restlessly in her womb, as if also sensing the tension taking over the environment. She had met Michael 5 years ago, when he still had dreams and talked about building a happy family, but the last few months had transformed the gentle man she loved into someone desperate and unpredictable. The medical bills for prenatal care, the overdue rent, the lack of steady work in construction, everything had accumulated like an avalanche that now threatened to completely bury their lives. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered to the unborn baby, "My child, I would do anything to protect you. Anything at all," she murmured, feeling a twinge of pain in her back. When the loan sharks finally left, leaving behind only threats and the fatal deadline of 24 hours, Michael entered the room like a ghost, his face pale and eyes lost. He sat heavily next to Susan, placing his head in his hands, and for a few minutes the only sound in the house was that of the rain and the muffled sobs he tried to control. Susan extended her hand and gently touched her husband's shoulder, feeling how he trembled, and at that moment she knew something terrible was about to happen. The woman who had once been a teacher at a community school before losing her job now found herself reduced to a spectator of the destruction of everything they had built together. "Michael, we'll find a solution." "We always do," she said, trying to inject hope into words that sounded empty even to herself. Michael slowly raised his head, and Susan saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, a coldness that frightened her more than the loan shark's threats. He had spent the entire morning downtown, going from bank to bank, trying to secure a loan that no one was willing to grant someone without guarantees or formal work records. The afternoon had been spent in one last desperate attempt, talking to people he preferred to forget he knew, people who offered solutions to impossible problems, but always at a price no one should be willing to pay. The words one of these men had whispered in his ear still echoed in his mind like a slow poison. "Susan, I met a man today, a very rich man who is looking for someone special," said Michael, avoiding looking directly into his wife's eyes. The way Michael said those words made Susan's heart race, and instinctively, she placed both hands over her belly, as if she could protect the baby from what was coming. She had grown up in a humble family, but with solid values, and even in the worst difficulties, she always believed there were lines that should not be crossed. The silence that followed was heavy as lead, filled only by the sound of rain that seemed to be washing the world outside, while inside the small house, something precious was about to be lost forever. Susan felt a slight contraction, but ignored it, focusing all her attention on the man beside her, who seemed to be turning into a stranger before her eyes. "Michael, what are you trying to tell me? What kind of man is this?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and foreboding. Across town, in a 3-story mansion surrounded by impeccably maintained gardens, William was sitting in his private library, leafing through documents that represented a lifetime of work and accumulation of wealth. At 65, he was a man of medium stature, with grey hair combed back and blue eyes that once shone with ambition, but now reflected only the emptiness of an existence without purpose. His pale skin betrayed the months he had spent confined between doctors and treatments, fighting a cancer that specialists had declared terminal 6 months ago. The walls of the library were covered with books he would never have time to read again, and the windows offered a view of gardens he might not see bloom next spring. 65 years of life, and in the end, I have no one to share any of this with, he muttered to himself, looking at the papers containing the inventory of his fortune. William had built an empire in real estate, starting with a small apartment inherited from his mother, and transforming it into dozens of buildings and houses scattered throughout the city. He had never married, always claiming that work was his priority, and the relationships he had throughout his life were superficial and self-interested, women who approached him for his bank account, not for who he really was. Now facing imminent death, he found himself forced to confront the cruel irony of having everything and nothing at the same time. His lawyers had been clear. Without a direct heir or clearly designated beneficiary, much of his fortune would be consumed by taxes and legal disputes, benefiting only people who never cared about him. "I need to find someone, anyone who deserves to have a better chance in life," he thought, closing his eyes and feeling the weight of loneliness. The mansion's doorbell rang at 8 o'clock in the evening, interrupting William's melancholic thoughts. James, his 60-year-old butler, who had worked for him for more than 2 decades, appeared at the library door with a worried expression on his wrinkled face. James was more than an employee. He was the only person William could call a friend, and in recent months had also become his confidant and, in a way, his caretaker. The butler held a business card between his fingers, and by the hesitant way he approached, William realized that the visit was not common. James had seen many things over the years, but something that night left him visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. William, there is a man at the door. He says he has a proposal that might interest you, something related to what you mentioned about finding someone special," said James, his voice laden with concern. William rose slowly from the leather armchair, feeling the familiar pain that always accompanied his movements. The cancer had spread to his bones, and each step was a reminder that time was running out quickly. He wore a navy blue silk robe over his pajamas, and his feet were clad in soft leather slippers, details that once seemed important, but were now just part of the routine of a man who had nothing left to conquer except a little more time. Curiosity, however, was stronger than pain, and he decided to receive the visitor, even not knowing exactly what to expect from that unexpected encounter. "Bring him to the living room, James, and prepare tea for 3 people," said William, intuiting that the conversation would be long and complicated. Michael entered the mansion like someone visiting a completely different world from his own, eyes wide at the luxury that surrounded him on all sides. The marble floor reflected the light from the crystal chandeliers, and the artwork on the walls was worth more than he would earn in several lifetimes of work. His simple clothes, still damp from the rain, contrasted drastically with the elegance of the environment, making him feel like an intruder in a palace. William received him in the living room, a spacious room with Italian leather sofas and a center table made of fine wood, where James had prepared tea as requested. The 2 men observed each other in silence for a few seconds, each trying to decipher the other's intentions, before William gestured for Michael to sit down. "I heard you have a proposal for me." "I'm a direct man, so I prefer that you be clear about what you want," said William, his voice firm despite his physical weakness. Michael swallowed hard before beginning to speak, the words tumbling out as if he were trying to get rid of them as quickly as possible. He explained his desperate financial situation, the debt to loan sharks, the threats hanging over his family, and finally came to the central point of his proposal: Susan. He described his wife as a kind, intelligent woman who had been a teacher and was now 7 months pregnant, needing care and protection that he could no longer provide. The words came out as if he were trying to convince himself that he was doing the right thing, selling the idea as if it were an arrangement that would benefit all parties involved. William listened in silence, his blue eyes fixed on the man in front of him, trying to understand if he was facing a desperate father or simply someone willing to sell his own family. "I understand your situation, but I need to meet your wife before making any decision. This is not something that can be decided in one conversation," said William, his voice careful and measured. Michael's proposal was simple in its cruelty. Susan would live in the mansion as William's caretaker, and in exchange, he would pay $15,000 immediately to settle the debts, as well as provide medical assistance for the birth and subsequent care. Michael presented the arrangement as temporary, just until he could re-establish himself financially, but both he and William knew those words were just a way to make the transaction more palatable. William, for his part, saw in the proposal an opportunity to have company in his last months of life and, mainly, someone to whom he could leave his inheritance, thus solving the problem his lawyers had pointed out. The conversation lasted more than 2 hours, with Michael alternating between pleas and attempts to make the proposal more attractive, while William weighed the moral and practical aspects of the situation. "If I accept this, I need to be sure that she is coming of her own free will, not just under pressure. I will send my lawyer to talk to her tomorrow morning," William finally said. When Michael returned home, it was past midnight, and Susan was awake in bed, looking at the ceiling and feeling the baby moving restlessly inside her. She had spent the last few hours trying to mentally prepare herself for whatever Michael might have decided, but when he sat on the edge of the bed and began to explain the details of his conversation with William, she felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. Her husband's words sounded distant, as if coming from far away, as she tried to process the fact that she was being offered as a solution to the family's financial problems. Michael spoke about William as if he were a kind and lonely man, someone who just needed company, but Susan was not naive and perfectly understood what was really being proposed. The pain in her back had increased during the night, and she felt sporadic contractions that she tried to ignore, focusing all her energy on understanding the magnitude of what was happening. "Michael, you're asking me to leave our home and go live with a stranger for money. How do you expect me to accept this?" she asked, her voice breaking with emotion. Michael tried to explain that there were no other options, that the loan sharks would return the next morning, and that without the money, all of them would be in real danger. He talked about William as if he had known the man for years, describing the mansion, the kindness of the butler, the library full of books, trying to paint a picture of a life better than the one she had now. Susan listened in silence, tears flowing freely down her face, while feeling the baby kicking inside her as if also protesting against the situation. She thought of her mother, who had died 2 years before, and how disappointed she would be if she knew her daughter was being sold like a commodity. But she also thought about the child who was about to be born, the life of deprivation that awaited them if they continued in that situation, and the real possibility that something terrible might happen to Michael if he didn't pay the debt. "If I do this, if I agree to go with this man, do you promise that you will use this time to recover, to become the man I married?" she asked, knowing that this might be the last time she would speak to Michael as his wife. Morning arrived grey and rainy, as if the sky itself was lamenting what was about to happen. Susan had spent the night awake, alternating between periods of silent crying and moments of resigned acceptance, trying to find the strength to do what she believed was best for everyone involved. She packed a small suitcase with her few maternity clothes, some personal items that had sentimental value, and the only photo she had of her mother. Each item she put in the suitcase seemed to represent a piece of her identity that was being left behind, and she wondered if she would ever be able to recover who she really was after all this was over. Michael tried to appear optimistic, talking about how this would just be a difficult phase that would soon pass, but Susan saw in his eyes the same uncertainty she felt in her heart. "Susan, I promise I'll work hard to bring you back. This isn't forever," said Michael, embracing her for the last time as her husband. William's lawyer arrived at 10 in the morning, a middle-aged man wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He carefully explained the terms of the agreement. Susan would live in William's mansion, care for him as her health allowed, and in return would receive complete medical assistance, food, housing, and a monthly payment that would be deposited into an account opened specifically for her. The lawyer was clear in emphasizing that Susan would be free to leave at any time, that nothing was forced in the arrangement, and that William was genuinely interested in helping someone who needed a better opportunity in life. Susan listened to everything in silence, signing the papers with trembling hands, while feeling increasingly frequent contractions that she tried to hide. When the time came to leave, she looked for the last time at the small house where she had spent the last 5 years, knowing that she would never again be the same person who was leaving that place. "I promise I'll take good care of myself and the baby. That's what you would do, isn't it, Mother?" she thought, touching her belly and mentally speaking to her deceased mother. The car that came to pick up Susan was a black limousine with dark windows, driven by a uniformed driver who introduced himself only as Mark. During the journey through the city, Susan observed through the window the familiar streets passing by, each block leaving her further from her previous life and closer to a completely uncertain future. The contractions were becoming stronger and more regular, but she decided not to say anything, fearing that this might complicate an already complex situation even more. Mark was a quiet but kind man, and when he noticed that Susan was uncomfortable, he offered water and slowed down the car. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained cloudy, as if reflecting Susan's emotional state. "Mom, if you need anything during the trip, please let me know. Mr. William asked us to take very good care of you," said Mark, looking through the rearview mirror with a paternal smile. When they finally arrived at William's mansion, Susan felt as if she was entering a completely different world, a place where people like her didn't naturally belong. The gardens were perfectly maintained, with flowers of all colors and water fountains that created a relaxing sound, but she could barely appreciate the beauty around her because the contractions were becoming impossible to ignore. James welcomed her at the main door with a respectful bow, and she noticed in the butler's eyes a genuine kindness that reassured her a bit. William was waiting for her in the living room, wearing a light grey suit despite being at home, and when she entered the room, he stood up politely, a gesture of courtesy she had not expected. They greeted each other formally, each trying to decipher the other, until Susan felt a particularly strong contraction and had to support herself on the arm of the sofa. "William, I need to tell you something important. I think my baby is coming." "Now," she whispered, feeling a wave of panic mixed with relief for finally being able to admit what was happening. James acted with the speed of someone who had faced emergencies throughout his 60 years of life, picking up the phone and dialing the private medical emergency service that William had kept in contact with for years. The ambulance arrived in less than 15 minutes, equipped with all the necessary devices to stabilize Susan during the journey to the hospital. William followed in the car beside them, watching through the window as the paramedics worked to keep Susan conscious and comfortable, their serious faces revealing the gravity of the situation. The city traffic seemed to conspire against them, but Mark knew all the alternative routes and managed to follow the ambulance without losing sight of it. Throughout the journey, William found himself whispering words he hadn't said in decades, asking any higher power that might be listening to protect this woman he barely knew, but for whom he already felt a deep responsibility. "Please don't let me have caused the death of an innocent person. She doesn't deserve to pay for my loneliness," he thought, squeezing his cold hands. Santa Teresa Hospital was one of the most respected medical institutions in the region, with a maternity ward specialized in high-risk cases and a team of obstetricians that William had carefully researched in recent months, anticipating that he might need the best care for Susan. As soon as they arrived, a complete team was already waiting at the emergency entrance, previously alerted by James's phone call, and Susan was immediately taken to an examination room where doctors could assess her condition and the baby's. William remained in the waiting room, pacing back and forth, ignoring the pain in his bones that cancer caused with each sudden movement. He had spent the last 6 months concerned only with his own mortality, but now found himself confronted with the possibility that his actions could have fatal consequences for others. "Doctor, please tell me she and the baby will be all right." "I insist on paying all costs, regardless of the amount," said William to the doctor who came out of the examination room. Dr. Smith, a 50-year-old man with grey hair and steady hands that inspired confidence, explained to William that Susan was in premature labour, but that this was relatively common in cases of extreme stress, such as what she had experienced in the last 24 hours. The baby was in the correct position, but Susan's vital signs showed signs of high blood pressure and other complications that could make the delivery riskier than normal. The medical team had already decided that a cesarean delivery would be necessary to ensure the safety of both mother and child, especially considering that Susan was visibly weakened and emotionally distressed. William listened to every word with complete attention, taking mental notes and asking questions that demonstrated his determination to ensure that Susan received the best possible care. "Doctor, I want you to know that this woman is very important to me. Mobilize all necessary resources, bring the best specialists. Money is not an issue," declared William, his voice firm despite his anxiety. While Susan was being prepared for surgery, William found himself facing questions he had never considered before, wondering if his decision to accept Michael's proposal had been motivated by genuine compassion or simply disguised selfishness. He sat in the hospital chapel, a small multi-religious space with simple benches and a window overlooking an internal garden, and for the first time in decades tried to find some kind of spiritual connection that could give him guidance. The chapel walls were decorated with symbols from different religions, reminding him that hope and faith take many forms, but all converge on the same basic human desire for protection and care. William had built his fortune based on logic and calculation, but now found himself in a situation where only faith and hope could offer any kind of comfort. "If there is any God listening, please protect Susan and her baby. They have done nothing to deserve suffering because of my decisions," he murmured, closing his eyes and trying to find inner peace. The surgery began at 3 in the morning, in an operating room equipped with the most modern fetal and surgical monitoring devices. Susan had been anesthetized, but maintained moments of semi-consciousness where she whispered prayers she had learned from her mother, asking for divine protection for the child who was about to be born under such difficult circumstances. The medical team worked with surgical precision, led by Dr. Smith and assisted by an obstetrician specialized in high-risk deliveries, an anesthesiologist who constantly monitored Susan's vital signs, and 2 nurses who prepared everything to receive the newborn. William had insisted on paying for a complete team of neonatologists to be present during the birth, ensuring that the baby would receive immediate care if born with any complications. He remained in the hallway next to the operating room, able to hear the sounds of the equipment and the calm but focused voices of the doctors working. "Susan, you are stronger than you think. Fight for your child, fight for your life," thought William, pressing his hands against his chest. At 4:37 in the morning, a baby's cry echoed through the hospital corridors, a sound that brought tears to William's eyes and a sigh of relief that he didn't even know he was holding. The baby had been born healthy, weighing 2 kilograms and 800 grams, an appropriate weight considering the delivery had been a few weeks premature. William could hear the nurses commenting on how the baby was breathing well and responding adequately to stimuli, positive signs indicating that the child had overcome the first obstacles of life. But the initial joy was quickly replaced by concern when he realized that the activity in the operating room had not diminished and that the doctors continued to work intensely on Susan. James had arrived at the hospital with a suitcase containing clothes and personal items for William, anticipating that he would spend a long time there, and now remained at his employer's side, offering the kind of silent support that only decades of genuine friendship can provide. "Mr. William, the baby is fine. Now we need to have faith that the mother will be too," said James, placing a comforting hand on William's shoulder. The complications the doctors faced were more serious than initially predicted. Susan faced complications during surgery that required intensive medical care, demanding immediate transfusions and medications to stabilize her condition. William found himself running through the hospital corridors, accompanying doctors to the blood bank, signing authorizations for emergency procedures, and ensuring Susan had access to any treatment that could save her life. He had spent his entire life accumulating wealth, but had never found a more meaningful way to spend it than in those desperate moments where every dollar invested could mean the difference between Susan's life and death. The irony did not go unnoticed by him. A man dying of cancer, desperately fighting to save the life of a woman he barely knew, but who had already become more important to him than any business deal he had closed in decades. "Doctor, is there anything else we can do? Any specialist we can call? I'll pay any amount," said William, his voice heavy with desperation. During the following 6 hours, Susan remained in critical condition in the intensive care unit, connected to machines that monitored every heartbeat, every breath, every vital sign indicating whether she was fighting to return to life or surrendering to exhaustion. William did not leave the ICU corridor, refusing to eat or rest, ignoring James's pleas for him to take care of his own deteriorating health. He spent his time watching through the ICU glass, seeing Susan unconscious, surrounded by tubes and wires, and wondering if she could forgive him if she survived and discovered that he had been, in a way, responsible for putting her in that situation. The baby was in the nursery, being cared for by specialized nurses, and William had already given instructions for the child to receive all necessary care, regardless of what happened to Susan. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the sound of medical equipment and the silent prayers that William offered to any deity that might be listening to his desperate pleas. "Susan, you need to fight. Your son needs you, and I need the chance to make things right," whispered William, pressing his hand against the ICU glass. Dr. Smith left the ICU at 10 in the morning, removing his surgical mask and revealing a tired but hopeful expression. Susan had stabilized during the early morning, and although still in critical condition, her vital signs showed a gradual improvement, indicating that her body was responding positively to the treatments. William listened to every word from the doctor, as if it were a life or death sentence, taking mental notes about the next steps of the treatment and about the precautions that would need to be taken in the next 48 hours. The doctor explained that Susan would need to remain in the hospital for at least a week, and that even after discharge, she would require specialized care and absolute rest for several weeks. William immediately began making plans to transform one of the rooms in his mansion into a complete infirmary, with all the necessary equipment to monitor Susan's recovery and ensure that she had access to the best possible medical care. "Dr. Smith, I want to hire private nurses to care for her 24 hours a day. I also want you to recommend the best postpartum recovery specialists to follow the case," said William, his voice reflecting unwavering determination. While waiting for news about Susan, William took the time to meet the baby, who had been born in such dramatic circumstances. The hospital nursery was a carefully controlled environment, with ideal temperature and humidity for premature newborns, and when William saw the child for the first time, he felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in decades. The baby was small but perfectly formed, with a tuft of dark hair like his mother's and small clenched fists that moved gently while sleeping. William caught himself imagining what it would be like to see that child grow up, take his first steps, speak his first words, and realize that for the first time in his life, he had a concrete reason to want to live beyond his own existence. The nursery nurses explained that the baby was developing well despite the premature birth, and that he could probably go home with his mother as soon as Susan fully recovered. "Little one, you don't know it, but your arrival has changed many people's lives. I will do everything to ensure that you and your mother have the best possible future," murmured William, gently touching the glass of the incubator. The news that Michael had appeared at the hospital reached William through James, who had been informed by security that a man was asking about Susan and demanding to see her. William felt a mixture of anger and understanding upon learning that Michael was there, recognizing that, despite everything, the man had the right to know about his wife and child's condition. But William also knew that Susan was at a very delicate moment in her recovery, and that any additional stress could compromise her medical progress. He decided to meet Michael personally, to explain the situation and establish clear boundaries about when and how he could visit Susan. The meeting took place in the hospital lobby, where Michael waited nervously, his clothes still the same from the day before, revealing that he had spent the night without sleep, probably consumed by guilt and worry. William approached him cautiously, trying to maintain a calm tone despite the irritation he felt toward Michael, for putting Susan in such a dangerous situation. Michael, Susan and the baby are alive, but she is still in critical condition. You can see them, but only when the doctors authorize it, said William, his voice controlled but firm. Michael looked like a man destroyed by guilt and regret, his hands trembling as he tried to process the information William was giving him about Susan's condition and the birth of his child. He cried openly, asking William for forgiveness and begging to see his wife and child, promising that he would never put his family in danger again and that he would do anything to remedy the situation. William observed Michael with a mixture of pity and irritation, recognizing in the younger man the desperation of someone who had made terrible decisions for understandable reasons, but who now faced the devastating consequences of his choices. The conversation between the two men was long and emotional, with Michael trying to explain his motivations and William clearly establishing that Susan and the baby were now under his protection and care. They reached a temporary agreement. Michael could visit Susan when she was well enough to receive visitors, but any decision about the family's future would be made only when Susan was completely recovered and could express her own wishes. Michael, you put Susan in danger, and now she almost died because of your decisions. I will protect her and the baby, and you will have to prove that you deserve to be in their lives again, said William, his tone making it clear that the situation had definitely changed. The next 12 hours were an emotional roller coaster for William, who alternated between moments of hope when doctors reported small improvements in Susan's condition, and periods of anxiety when some equipment triggered an alarm or when she showed signs of discomfort. He had established a routine between visiting Susan in the ICU, spending time watching the baby in the nursery, and talking with doctors about the next steps in treatment. James had brought a laptop and some important documents, allowing William to resolve urgent business matters without leaving the hospital, but he found it almost impossible to concentrate on anything other than Susan's recovery. For the first time in decades, his business ventures seemed irrelevant compared to the well-being of two people who had entered his life less than 24 hours ago. The transformation in his priorities was so radical that he wondered if the cancer had affected not only his body, but also his ability to understand what really mattered in life. James, cancel all my meetings this week. Susan and the baby are my only priority now, said William, closing the laptop and focusing entirely on the medical situation. During the afternoon, Susan showed the first signs of consciousness since surgery, slightly moving her fingers and reacting weakly to the doctor's stimuli. William was present when she opened her eyes for the first time and saw in them a mixture of confusion, pain, and surprisingly, a fierce determination that deeply impressed him. Susan tried to speak, but the breathing tubes had not yet been removed, so she communicated through minimal gestures and facial expressions that William quickly learned to interpret. He gently held her hand, offering words of encouragement and assuring that the baby was fine and being cared for by the best professionals in the hospital. Susan seemed to fight against sedation and weakness to remain conscious, as if she instinctively knew she needed to recover quickly to care for her child. The determination William saw in her eyes reminded him of himself in the early years of his career, when he faced seemingly impossible obstacles with a willpower that seemed to come from an inexhaustible source. Susan, you are stronger than you imagine. Your son is waiting for you, and I will ensure that you both have everything you need, whispered William, gently squeezing her hand. When doctors finally removed Susan's breathing tubes, the first words she managed to whisper were a prayer of thanks for having survived and a question about her baby's condition. William was moved by the priority she gave to her child, even in her debilitated state, and quickly reassured her about the child's health, promising to take her to the nursery as soon as doctors authorized it. Susan was too weak to speak much, but managed to express her gratitude to William for taking care of her and the baby during the medical emergency. She also asked about Michael, a question that William carefully answered, explaining that her husband was concerned and wanted to visit her, but that any decision about when and how this would happen would depend on her recovery and her own wishes. Susan closed her eyes for a few moments, clearly exhausted by the effort of speaking, and William realized she was mentally processing everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. The conversation was brief, but William felt that he had established a genuine connection with Susan, based not only on the circumstances that had united them, but on a mutual respect that was growing between them. "William, thank you for saving my life and my son's. I don't know how I'll repay your kindness," whispered Susan, her words loaded with genuine emotion. Susan's recovery continued to progress during the night, but doctors kept her under constant observation due to the complications she had faced during childbirth. William remained at the hospital, sleeping in an uncomfortable armchair next to the ICU, refusing to go home even when James insisted that he needed to rest properly to take care of his own health. During the quiet hours of dawn, William reflected on how his life had completely changed in less than 2 days, and how 2 people he barely knew had become more important to him than anything else in his existence. He thought about his own mortality and how he wanted to use the time he had left, coming to the conclusion that caring for Susan and her baby could be the most significant legacy he would leave in the world. The sense of purpose he experienced was completely new, different from the superficial satisfaction he had felt when accumulating wealth or closing profitable deals. "Perhaps this is the reason I'm still alive. To protect these 2 innocent lives and give them the opportunities they deserve," William thought, watching Susan sleep peacefully for the first time since giving birth. The next morning, 18 hours after the emergency delivery began, Dr. Smith left the ICU with an expression that William couldn't immediately decipher. The doctor walked slowly toward William, removing his glasses and cleaning them carefully, a gesture that only increased William's anxiety about the news he was about to receive. James approached as well, perceiving from the doctor's body language that something important was about to be communicated. William rose from the armchair where he had spent the night, feeling his legs tremble slightly, not knowing if it was because of fatigue, tension, or fear of what he might hear. Dr. Smith looked directly into William's eyes before speaking, his expression grave but not hopeless, like someone who was about to share news that was simultaneously good and concerning. "Mr. William, we managed to save the baby, and he is developing perfectly well for a premature infant, but the mother, she lost a lot of blood during the surgery. The next 48 hours are critical in determining whether she will recover completely," said the doctor, his voice careful and measured. A few days after the dramatic birth, Susan had finally stabilized enough to be discharged from the hospital, but Dr. Smith was clear in emphasizing that she would need specialized care and absolute rest for several weeks. William had spent those 3 days completely transforming the main guest room of his mansion, hiring a company specializing in medical equipment to install everything necessary to monitor Susan's recovery. The room now had an adjustable hospital bed, equipment to measure blood pressure and oxygenation, an emergency call system connected directly to William's phone, and even a mini fridge with medications that needed to be kept at a controlled temperature. James had supervised every detail of the installation, ensuring that the environment was both functional and welcoming, with fresh flowers in the windows and a comfortable armchair where William could sit during his daily visits. When Susan was brought from the ambulance on a stretcher, her eyes filled with tears upon seeing the care William had taken to prepare a recovery space worthy of any private hospital. "William, I can't believe you did all this for me. How will I ever repay such kindness and care?" whispered Susan, her voice still weak but filled with genuine emotion. William had hired 2 nurses specialized in postpartum care to alternate in 12-hour shifts, ensuring that Susan had professional assistance 24 hours a day during the first weeks of recovery. The day shift nurse was a 40-year-old woman with 20 years of experience in obstetrics, who had worked in the best hospitals in the city and whom William had personally chosen after interviewing dozens of candidates. The night shift nurse, younger but equally qualified, specialized in neonatal care and could help Susan establish a healthy routine of breastfeeding and baby care. But despite having hired the best professionals available, William discovered that he himself wanted to actively participate in Susan's care, bringing her meals, helping her move around when necessary, and spending hours talking with her about her recovery and about the baby. This personal dedication surprised even James, who had known William for decades and had never seen him show such care and attention to another person. "Mr. William, you're behaving like a concerned father with his daughter. It's beautiful to see this transformation in you," commented James, watching William adjust Susan's pillows to make her more comfortable. The baby, who had not yet received an official name, was developing exceptionally well despite the premature birth, gaining weight adequately and demonstrating healthy reflexes that indicated normal neurological development. William had installed a hospital crib in Susan's room, allowing her to have her son always nearby and facilitating breastfeeding during the night. During the first few weeks, Susan was still too weak to fully care for the baby alone, so William found himself learning things he never imagined he would need to know. How to change diapers, how to prepare supplementary bottles, how to recognize the baby's different types of crying and what each meant. He discovered he had a natural patience with the child, and that holding the little one in his arms gave him a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Susan watched William interact with her son with a mixture of gratitude and amazement, realizing that this rich and lonely man was transforming into a genuine paternal figure before her eyes. "William, you hold my son with such care that it seems you've always been a grandfather. May I ask you to help choose a name for him?" Susan asked, smiling weakly as she watched William cradle the child. During the first week of recovery, Susan and William established a daily routine that allowed her to rest properly while gradually developing her physical and emotional strength. Mornings began with William personally bringing Susan's breakfast, always prepared by the private chef he had hired, specifically to ensure she received adequate nutrition for recovery and breastfeeding. They talked about various subjects during these meals, from books William recommended from his private library to stories of Susan's childhood, who had grown up in a humble but loving family before facing the difficulties that led her to this situation. William discovered that Susan was an intelligent and educated woman who had been a teacher before losing her job, and who possessed a perspective on life that made him question many of his own priorities and values. The afternoons were dedicated to caring for the baby, with William helping Susan move to the crib and offering physical support when she still felt dizzy or weak. "Susan, talking with you has made me realize how much I've isolated my life from truly important things. You are teaching me what it really means to live," William confessed, sitting in the armchair beside the bed. Susan, for her part, showed a gratitude that went far beyond polite words, expressing her appreciation through small gestures that deeply touched William. Even in her weakened state, she insisted on praying for William every night before sleeping, asking God to protect his health and reward him for the kindness he was showing. When William casually mentioned he was facing more intense pain due to the cancer, Susan asked to teach her some therapeutic massage exercises that could help relieve tension in his muscles and joints. Despite her own weakness, Susan insisted on preparing tea for William every afternoon, using medicinal herbs her mother had taught her about, and which, according to her, had natural healing properties. William was moved by this care, mainly because he realized it came from a place of genuine concern, not obligation or interest. "William, my mother always said that people enter our lives for a reason. Perhaps God placed us in each other's path because we both needed healing," Susan said, offering him a cup of tea with still trembling hands. As the days passed, William began to notice that his own health was stabilizing in a way that surprised his doctors. The constant pains that had accompanied him for months were more tolerable, he was sleeping better than he had in years, and even his appetite had gradually returned. His doctors attributed this improvement to a combination of factors: Susan's care with the medicinal herbs, the reduction in stress that her company provided, and especially the sense of purpose he had found in caring for Susan and the baby. William caught himself thinking less about his own mortality and more about the future he wanted to build for Susan and the child, a change in perspective that he recognized as deeply therapeutic. He began making long-term plans for the first time in months, considering how he could use his wealth to ensure that Susan had all the educational and professional opportunities she had lost, and that the baby would grow up with all the advantages money could provide. "James, schedule a meeting with my lawyers for next week. I want to start preparing the legal adoption documents for Susan and the baby. They are my family now," William said, his voice firm and decisive. The process of preparing the legal documents that would make Susan his adoptive daughter and the baby his official grandchild required several consultations with attorneys specializing in family law, but William was determined to ensure that both Susan and the child had full legal rights as his heirs. He carefully explained to Susan what he intended to do, emphasizing that it was not a way to control her or create obligations, but rather to ensure she had financial and legal security regardless of what happened to him in the future. Susan initially resisted the idea, arguing that she had done nothing to deserve such generosity, but William patiently explained that she had given him something far more valuable than any amount of money: a purpose and a family. They spent several afternoons discussing the legal details, with William explaining how his investments, properties and businesses worked, and how all of this would be managed to benefit Susan and the baby. The complexity of the legal issues was intimidating for Susan, who had spent her life dealing with much simpler financial problems, but William proved patient and didactic, explaining every aspect until she felt comfortable with the decisions being made. "Susan, I want you to understand that this is not charity. You and your son brought meaning to my life when I needed it most. Leaving my wealth to you is the only way to ensure it will be used for something truly important," explained William, gently holding her hand. During this recovery week, Susan also had to face the complicated issue of Michael, who had tried to visit her several times, but whom William had kept away until she felt strong enough to handle the emotional situation the meeting would represent. When Susan finally agreed to see him, the meeting took place in William's library, with him present to offer moral support and to ensure Michael did not put unnecessary pressure on Susan. The meeting was tense and emotionally charged, with Michael alternating between sincere requests for forgiveness and attempts to convince Susan to come home with him. Susan listened to everything Michael had to say, but was clear in explaining that she was not ready to make definitive decisions about her marriage, and that her immediate priority was to fully recover and ensure her child's well-being. William observed the conversation in silence, impressed by the maturity and firmness that Susan demonstrated, despite her still fragile physical condition. The meeting ended with Michael leaving alone, and Susan clearly relieved that she had managed to establish clear boundaries without being emotionally manipulated. "William, thank you for being present during this conversation. Having you by my side gave me the strength I needed to tell Michael the truth without feeling guilty," said Susan, her words laden with gratitude and relief. On the 5th day of recovery, Susan asked William if she could see his library, as she had been a teacher and missed contact with books during her convalescence. William was enthusiastic about the request, as his library was one of his personal prides, a collection of more than 5,000 volumes ranging from classics of world literature to specialized treatises on economics and philosophy. He helped Susan move to the library, where she spent the entire afternoon exploring the shelves and selecting books she would like to read during her recovery. William was impressed with Susan's choices, which demonstrated a refined taste and solid education that had been interrupted by life's circumstances, but which clearly remained an important part of her identity. They talked about favorite authors, books that had marked their lives, and how literature can offer different perspectives on the challenges we face. William offered to read aloud to Susan whenever she was too tired to hold a book, a proposal she accepted with pleasure, thus establishing yet another routine that brought them closer daily. "Susan, it's been decades since I've talked about literature with someone who truly understands and appreciates books. You are reminding me of pleasures I had forgotten existed," commented William, feeling a genuine joy he hadn't experienced in years. The care routine that William established for Susan also included moments of light exercise and physiotherapy, activities that he personally monitored to ensure she did not exert herself beyond what the doctors recommended. During these sessions, they talked about William's plans for the future, including his intention to create an educational fund for the baby and to help Susan resume her studies to obtain certifications that would allow her to return to work as a teacher when she felt ready. William discovered that planning Susan and the baby's future gave him more satisfaction than any financial investment he had made in decades, and that thinking about how his wealth could be used to create real opportunities for other people was more rewarding than simply accumulating it. Susan, in turn, was moved by William's plans, but also concerned about the possibility of taking advantage of his generosity, a feeling that William patiently worked to dispel through long conversations about how she had transformed his life in a much more meaningful way than anything he could offer in return. "William, sometimes I feel like I'm living in a dream and I'm afraid of waking up and finding that none of this is real. How can I be sure that I deserve all this kindness?" asked Susan, expressing vulnerabilities that deeply touched William's heart. This concern of Susan's about whether or not she deserved the kindness she was receiving led to several deep conversations between her and William about values, merit, and the meaning of life. William shared with her his own reflections on how he had spent decades accumulating wealth without finding real purpose, and how meeting her had shown him that a person's value is not measured by their material possessions, but by their capacity to love and care for others. He explained that she demonstrated daily qualities that he had lost over the years: genuine compassion, capacity to forgive, faith even in difficult circumstances, and a perspective on life that prioritized relationships and emotional well-being above material achievements. Susan, in turn, helped William understand that his current generosity was not simply a matter of money, but a fundamental transformation in his way of seeing the world and relating to other people. These conversations happened mainly during the afternoons, when the baby was sleeping, and they had time for deeper reflections on their life experiences and on how they had arrived at that moment of genuine connection. "Susan, you have taught me that real wealth is not what we accumulate, but what we share with people we love. I was dying alone until you came into my life," said William, his voice filled with sincere emotion. William also began to share with Susan details about his own life story, including the loneliness he had experienced during decades of exclusive focus on work, the superficial relationships he had maintained with people interested only in his wealth, and especially the existential emptiness he had faced upon receiving his terminal cancer diagnosis. He explained how he had spent months preparing to die without leaving a meaningful legacy, and how meeting her had given him a reason to want to fight for life and to use his remaining time in a more meaningful way. Susan listened to these confessions with deep empathy, offering perspectives on forgiveness, purpose, and renewal that came from her religious background and her own experiences of overcoming hardship. She helped William understand that it is never too late to change the course of a life, and that his present actions could completely redefine the meaning of all his previous existence. These conversations strengthened the bond between them, but also served as a form of mutual therapy, where both processed traumas and fears through sharing and emotional support. "William, God never gives up on us, even when we give up on ourselves. You still have plenty of time to make a difference in many people's lives," said Susan, offering words of hope that resonated deeply in William's heart. On the 7th day of the recovery week, Susan was already strong enough to walk around the mansion without assistance, and William made a point of showing her all the rooms, including the external gardens that he maintained with meticulous care. Susan was impressed with the beauty of the property, but especially with small details that revealed William's personality. Photographs of trips he had taken alone, books marked with personal notes, plants that he personally cared for because they gave him a sense of connection with nature. They spent the afternoon in the garden, with Susan sitting in a comfortable chair, while William showed her the different species of flowers he cultivated, many of which had special meanings or stories associated with important moments in his life. The baby was with them, sleeping peacefully in a stroller that William had purchased specifically for these outdoor walks. The atmosphere was one of domestic peace, a completely new experience for William, who had never shared his home so intimately with another person. "William, walking through this house and these gardens with you makes me feel as if we were part of a royal family. It's a feeling I haven't had for a long time," said Susan, watching William tend to the plants with a gentleness that contrasted with the image of ruthless businessman he had cultivated for decades. During that same afternoon in the garden, William finally found the courage to verbally express something he had been thinking about all week: his desire for Susan and the baby to stay with him permanently, not as a temporary arrangement or as a result of difficult circumstances, but as a free choice based on the genuine affection that had developed between them. He carefully explained that he wasn't trying to replace a family he had never had, but that he had discovered that her and the baby's presence had transformed his house into a home in a way he had never experienced before. Susan listened to his proposal attentively, clearly touched by William's sincerity, but also aware of the complexity of the situation they were in. She expressed her own gratitude and affection for William, but also her concerns about whether her decisions were being influenced by gratitude or by a realistic assessment of what would be best for her and her son in the long term. The conversation was long and emotional, with both expressing vulnerabilities and hopes they had previously kept guarded. William assured Susan that any decision she made would be respected, and that he would continue to support her regardless of her choice about where and how she wanted to build her future. "Susan, I want you to know that my proposal comes from the heart, not from an attempt to control you. You both have transformed my life, and I would like to have the opportunity to be part of your lives," said William, his words carefully chosen to express love without pressure. Susan's response to William's proposal was characteristic of her reflective and careful nature. She asked for time to think about all the implications of the decision, including the impact it would have on her child, on her own identity and independence, and on the future of her relationship with Michael. She explained that she needed to be sure that any choice she made was based on her own judgment, not on gratitude or fear of facing the difficulties of rebuilding her life independently. William fully respected her need for time and reflection, assuring her that there was no rush for a decision and that he would continue to support her regardless of how long she needed to decide. They agreed that Susan would spend a few more weeks recovering at the mansion, during which she would have time to observe how she felt about the life they could build together, and to assess whether the connection between them was strong enough to sustain a permanent family relationship. During the remaining hours of that afternoon, they returned inside the house in a state of thoughtful tranquility, each processing the conversations they had had and the possibilities that opened before them. "William, I need to be sure that any decision I make about our future is based on what is best for my child and what I truly feel in my heart," said Susan, her voice reflecting the seriousness with which she was considering all dimensions of the situation. On the morning of the 8th day, while William and Susan were having breakfast together and discussing plans for the next week, the sound of the mansion's doorbell interrupted them abruptly and unexpectedly. James went to answer the door, but quickly returned with a worried expression, informing them that Michael was at the entrance, visibly drunk and agitated, demanding to see Susan and making loud statements that could be heard by the neighbors. William immediately stood up from the table, instructing Susan to stay in the room with the baby, while he dealt with the situation, but she insisted on accompanying him, arguing that she needed to face Michael personally to make her boundaries and decisions clear. The walk to the front door was tense, with William clearly concerned about Michael's emotional state and the possibility that the situation could escalate into something more serious. When they reached the door, they could see Michael on the other side of the glass, his clothes disheveled, eyes red from alcohol and lack of sleep, and an aggressive posture that was completely different from the repentant man who had visited Susan in the hospital. James kept the door locked but was clearly prepared to call security if necessary. Michael banged on the door with increasing force, his voice laden with anger and desperation. "Where's my wife and son? Did you think I'd forget? I want them back. And I want more money," Michael shouted, his voice echoing through the silent mourning of the residential neighborhood. William made the decision to open the door against James's silent protests, who gestured for them to wait for private security to arrive. The door opened, revealing Michael in a worse state than they had imagined, with clothes that appeared not to have been changed for days, overgrown beard, and a strong odor of alcohol that invaded the entrance hall. His eyes were bloodshot from a mixture of alcohol, desperation, and something dangerously close to total loss of control. Michael pushed the door forcefully, nearly knocking William down, and entered the mansion like a destructive hurricane, shouting Susan's name and demanding to know where his property was. "Michael, stop this immediately. You're scaring my son and disrespecting people who have only treated me with kindness," said Susan, her voice trembling but firm. Michael turned to Susan with an expression that mixed possessiveness and fury, pointing his finger as if she were a disobedient child. He began to speak hastily, alternating between accusations that Susan had sold herself for luxury and declarations that he had learned his lesson and was ready to be a better husband. William watched with growing alarm, realizing that Michael wasn't just drunk, but in a mental state that could easily escalate to physical violence. The man paced back and forth across the room, gesticulating wildly, his hands trembling from nervous agitation that suggested days without proper sleep. "Susan, You're my wife. This rich old man may have bought your body for a while, but he can't buy your soul or my son's," shouted Michael, his voice echoing off the mansion's walls. William stepped forward, physically placing himself between Michael and Susan, an action that irritated the drunken man even more. Michael began to make direct threats against William, calling him a predator of vulnerable women and accusing him of taking advantage of a desperate situation. William maintained his external calm, but felt his blood pressure rising dangerously. Michael then changed tactics, addressing Susan directly and reminding her of happy moments they had shared, of plans they had made together, using emotional guilt to make her question her recent decisions. "Susan, have you forgotten everything we built together? Forgotten that you promised me in church that we would be together in wealth and poverty?" said Michael, adopting a tone of false vulnerability. Susan listened to the manipulations with a mental clarity that surprised her, recognizing the same patterns of emotional blackmail that had characterized the last years of her marriage. She adjusted the baby in her arms, using the physical presence of her son as a source of strength to respond with a firmness she didn't know she possessed. Susan calmly explained that she had had a week to reflect on her life, her priorities, and the kind of future she wanted for her son, and that this reflection had made it clear that returning to Michael would mean returning to a cycle of instability and destructive decisions. She spoke about how William had treated her and the baby with respect, dignity, and genuine care, contrasting with years of emotional neglect from Michael. "Michael, you sold me as if I were merchandise, and now you want me to return as if nothing happened. I deserve more than that, and my son deserves more too," said Susan, her voice growing in confidence. Michael's response to the clear rejection was an explosion of rage that confirmed William's worst fears about the potential for violence. Michael began to shout increasingly wild accusations, calling Susan a prostitute, William a pervert, and threatening to destroy the reputation of both. He revealed that he had spent days investigating William, discovering details about his business, his medical condition, and his social connections, information he now used as verbal weapons. Michael threatened to contact newspapers with a distorted version of the story, painting William as a predator and Susan as a woman who had abandoned her family for money. James had moved discreetly to a position where he could physically intervene if necessary, keeping the phone within reach to call for help. "William, you may be rich, but I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are. And Susan, you'll discover that choosing money over family has consequences," shouted Michael, spitting the words with venomous intensity. William took another step forward, his own emotions finally overcoming his attempt to maintain diplomacy, and responded with a firmness that surprised even himself. He declared that he would not be intimidated by threats from a man who had proven incapable of properly caring for his family, and that any attempt to harm Susan would be met with all the legal and financial power he possessed. William explained in detail how Michael had put Susan in an impossible situation, forcing her to choose between personal dignity and survival, and how this sale had been documented by lawyers who could refute any distorted narrative. He also mentioned security recordings of all interactions, evidence sufficient to protect both William and Susan from defamation campaigns. The emotional intensity was clearly affecting William physically, with drops of sweat appearing on his forehead and a growing paleness that James observed with concern. "Michael, you lost the right to call Susan and this child your family the moment you decided to sell them for money. Now they are under my protection," declared William, his voice laden with authority. The mention of security recordings shook Michael, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his intimidation strategy. Michael began making more direct and personal threats, suggesting that William wouldn't live long enough to enjoy his new family, a cruel reference to the terminal cancer. He also made intimidating comments about his rights as a father, causing concern about his intentions. Susan lost her composure when Michael began directly threatening her baby's safety, shouting back and declaring that she would never allow him to come near her child. The discussion escalated to a level of intensity beyond what anyone was prepared to handle, with voices overlapping, accusations being shouted, and a physical tension that suggested imminent violence. James made the decision to call private security and the police. "Michael, "If you ever come near my son, I myself will ensure you're arrested for threats and attempted kidnapping," shouted Susan, embracing the baby with protective force. It was during this moment of most intense confrontation that William began to feel alarming physical signs that he initially tried to ignore. A sharp pain in his chest, different from the familiar pains caused by cancer, began radiating down his left arm, accompanied by dizziness that made him lean against the wall. Michael, absorbed in his fury, didn't notice William's signs of distress, but James and Susan immediately noticed the change in his appearance. William tried to continue speaking, but his words began coming out confused and he started sweating profusely. Susan tried to approach to offer support, but Michael blocked her path, misinterpreting the movement as acting. The tension of the situation had overwhelmed William's already compromised cardiovascular system. James abandoned any pretense of discretion and ran to William, shouting for Michael to stop. "Mr. William is having a heart problem." "Michael, stop this madness right now before you cause his death," shouted James, trying to help William sit down. Michael initially reacted with skepticism, accusing William of faking a medical emergency. But when he saw William actually collapse to the floor, losing consciousness completely, even he seemed to recognize the gravity of the situation. Susan safely placed the baby in his stroller and ran to William's side, kneeling and checking his breathing and pulse with the precision of someone who had learned first aid. James was already on the phone with emergency services, giving the address and describing the symptoms. Michael remained paralyzed, clearly shocked by how quickly the situation had deteriorated, his expressions of anger replaced by something approaching remorse. Susan began performing basic chest compressions, her hands trembling with fear and adrenaline, but determined to keep William stable until the paramedics arrived. "William, please don't leave me now." "You are all my child and I have in this world," whispered Susan, tears running down her face. The ambulance arrived in record time, with experienced paramedics who immediately took over William's care, connecting him to monitoring equipment and administering emergency medications. Susan was gently moved aside by the professionals, who needed space to work, but remained as close as possible, holding the baby and watching every movement with intense attention. Michael had withdrawn to a corner, clearly shaken by the reality that his actions might have contributed to a fatal medical emergency. James provided essential medical information to the paramedics, including details about William's cancer treatment, medications he was taking, and the name of his cardiologist, crucial information for emergency treatment. The paramedics worked with professional efficiency, but Susan could see in their expressions that the situation was more serious than they would have liked. "James, he's going to be all right, isn't he? William is strong. He's endured cancer so far, he can overcome this too," said Susan, seeking reassurance that James could not honestly offer. During the journey to the hospital, Susan held William's unconscious hand while the paramedics continued monitoring his vital signs and administering medications to keep his condition stable. The baby had calmed down and was sleeping in Susan's lap, unaware of the gravity of the situation. Susan spoke softly to William, telling him about the plans they had made together, how he had transformed her life and the baby's, and how she needed him to fight to recover. She also prayed silently, asking God to protect the man who had become more than a benefactor. The paramedics occasionally made adjustments to the equipment or administered additional medications, but their expressions remained carefully professional. Susan tried to interpret each sound from the machines, looking for signs of improvement or deterioration. When they arrived at the hospital, William was immediately taken to the cardiac emergency unit, where a team of specialists was already waiting. Susan was directed to a nearby waiting room where she could await news while the doctors worked to stabilize William. The room was small and sterile, with uncomfortable chairs and a television that Susan couldn't process due to her concern. The baby woke up and needed to be fed, an activity that became surreal in the context of the medical emergency. James arrived about an hour later, bringing a suitcase with essential items and confirmation that Michael had left and that security was monitoring the property. They sat together, sharing concerns about William, trying to keep hope alive. "James, I feel responsible for this. If I had been firmer with Michael from the beginning, perhaps William wouldn't have gone through so much stress," said Susan, fighting against feelings of guilt. After 3 hours of agonizing waiting, a cardiologist finally emerged from the cardiac unit, removing his surgical mask and walking towards Susan and James with a grave expression that made Susan's heart race with anxiety. The cardiologist explained that William had suffered a significant myocardial infarction, complicated by his already debilitated condition due to terminal cancer. He described the procedures they had performed to clear the blocked arteries and restore blood flow to the heart, but also explained that the damage to the heart muscle had been substantial. Susan listened to every word with complete attention, asking questions when she didn't understand medical terms, trying to fully comprehend the implications. The cardiologist explained that William was stable at the moment, but remained unconscious and connected to life support machines, and that the next 24 hours would be critical. "I need to know the truth. What are really the chances of William fully recovering from this situation?" asked Susan, mentally preparing herself for a devastating answer. The cardiologist's response was carefully honest, but did not offer the reassurance that Susan had hoped for. He explained that the combination of the heart attack with William's already debilitated condition due to cancer created an extremely complex medical situation, and that even if he survived the next 24 hours, he could face permanent heart damage that would significantly limit his quality of life and life expectancy. The cardiologist also mentioned that William was in an induced coma to allow his body to focus on recovery, but that there were no guarantees that he would regain consciousness or that he would be able to function normally if he woke up. Susan absorbed this information with an outward calm that contrasted with the internal emotional storm, recognizing that she needed to be strong for the baby and for William. "I want to stay by his side during these 24 hours. If William wakes up, I want him to know he's not alone," said Susan, her voice reflecting determination that came from deep filial love. The next morning, after almost 24 hours since the heart attack, Susan was feeding the baby when she saw the cardiologist walking toward her with an expression she couldn't interpret. The cardiologist sat down next to her and James, removing his glasses and cleaning them slowly, a gesture that increased Susan's anxiety about the news she was about to receive. He explained that William had been stable overnight, but during the last few hours, his vital signs had begun to show worrying signs of deterioration that could indicate secondary complications to the original heart attack. The cardiologist described how William's heart was struggling to pump blood adequately, and how his kidney function was also being affected by decreased blood circulation. Susan listened with growing horror, realizing that William might be losing his battle for life. "Please tell me exactly what this means. Is William dying?" asked Susan, her voice breaking as she prepared herself for a devastating truth. The cardiologist paused for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully before responding to Susan's direct question. He explained that William was in cardiac arrest and that the next procedures would be extremely risky, given his already compromised state, but they were the only chance to save him. The cardiologist described how they would need to perform emergency surgery to try to repair the damage to the heart, but that the chances of success were significantly reduced by William's condition and the complications that had arisen. Susan felt as if the world was crumbling, but forced herself to maintain composure in order to make important decisions about William's treatment. The baby began to cry, adding emotional urgency to an already desperate situation. Susan looked at the cardiologist with tears in her eyes, but with fierce determination to fight for William. "Do everything possible to save him. William risked his life to protect my son and me, and now it's our turn to fight for him," said Susan, authorizing the procedures with a voice that trembled but remained firm. After 6 hours of surgery, the cardiologist finally emerged from the operating room, removing his surgical mask and walking slowly towards Susan and James with an expression they couldn't decipher. His surgical clothes were marked by the long procedure, and he seemed physically exhausted from the effort of trying to save William. Susan rose immediately, holding the baby against her chest and mentally preparing herself to receive news that could change her life forever. James positioned himself beside her, offering physical support should she need it, and both awaited the cardiologist's words with a mixture of hope and terror. He looked directly into Susan's eyes before speaking, his expression reflecting the gravity of the situation they all faced. "He's in cardiac arrest. We need to take him to the hospital immediately, but the chances are minimal, said the paramedic who had run out of the operating room, shouting instructions to the team that was preparing William for emergency transport. The cardiac intensive care unit of the hospital became Susan's entire world during the 3 longest days of her life, an aseptic space where time seemed suspended between hope and despair. William remained unconscious, connected to a complex network of machines that monitored every heartbeat, every assisted breath, every vital sign that would determine whether he would fight to return to life or surrender to the exhaustion of a body that had faced cancer and now a devastating heart attack. Susan had established a rigid routine beside the hospital bed, alternating between periods of silent prayer, one-sided conversations with the unconscious William, and caring for the baby who seemed to sense the tension of the environment through his mother's restlessness. James visited them regularly, bringing meals that Susan barely touched and updates about the mansion, but respecting her wish to keep constant vigil beside the man who had become her chosen family. The nurses had grown accustomed to Susan's constant presence, admiring her unwavering dedication and occasionally offering words of encouragement when they saw silent tears running down her face during the most difficult moments. "William, I know you can hear me somewhere in there. My son and I are here waiting for you to come back to us," Susan whispered, holding his cold hand while watching the rhythmic movement of the respirator. During the first day in the cardiac ICU, Susan faced the unwelcome visit from Michael, who appeared at the hospital visibly more sober and apparently remorseful about the confrontation that had precipitated William's medical crisis. Michael tried a completely different approach, speaking in low and restrained tones about how he had spent the night reflecting on his actions and had come to the conclusion that perhaps it would be better for Susan and the baby to return home with him, away from the complicated situation they had created with William. Susan listened to his words with a patience that came not from consideration for Michael, but from emotional exhaustion that left her without energy for additional confrontations. She explained calmly but with absolute firmness that her decision was definitively made. She would remain by William's side as long as he needed her, just as he had remained by her side during her own recovery. Michael tried to argue about family responsibilities, about how the baby needed stability, about how William might never recover, but Susan responded to each argument with a determination that seemed to grow with every word she uttered. "Michael, you lost the right to speak about family when you decided to sell us. William chose us when no one else wanted us, and now I choose to stay by his side until the end," said Susan, her voice low but charged with a conviction that admitted no questioning. Michael's attempt to use emotional blackmail again failed completely in the face of the new Susan, who had emerged from the experiences of recent weeks, a woman who had discovered her own strength through the unconditional love that William had demonstrated for her and her child. Michael mentioned the financial difficulties they would face if William died, the legal complications that could arise, the uncertainty of the future that Susan would be choosing, but each argument only reinforced her determination to remain loyal to the man who had risked his life to protect her. Susan explained that she had learned that real security did not come from financial guarantees or relationships based on fear and dependence, but from genuine connections based on mutual respect and true care. She also made it clear that, even if William did not survive, she would never return to Michael, preferring to face any difficulty alone rather than return to a relationship that had become toxic and destructive. James, who had witnessed part of the conversation, offered silent but firm support, positioning himself in a way that Michael understood that Susan had allies who would protect her from any additional pressure. "Michael, I am no longer the desperate woman you sold 2 weeks ago. William taught me that I have my own worth, and now I know that I deserve to be treated with dignity," declared Susan, looking directly into Michael's eyes with a firmness that made him back away. During the second day in the ICU, Susan developed a more structured routine that allowed her to properly care for the baby while maintaining her vigil by William's side. She had brought some books from William's personal library, volumes of poetry and literature, that she began to read aloud to him, believing that her familiar voice might somehow penetrate the barrier of unconsciousness and remind him that there were reasons to fight for life. Between readings, Susan told stories about the baby, describing each small development, each smile, each movement that William was missing, but that she carefully documented to share with him when he awoke. She also shared memories of her own childhood, stories about her deceased mother, reflections on faith and purpose that she had learned over the years, creating a continuous narrative that transformed the hospital room into an intimate space of family connection. The nurses occasionally stopped to listen to Susan reading, commenting among themselves about how rare it was to see such dedication and how her constant presence seemed to have a positive effect on William's monitoring equipment. William, today our son smiled for the first time when James made a funny face. You need to wake up to see this smile that lights up the entire world, Susan murmured, gently placing the baby's small hand on William's hand. It was during the afternoon of the second day that Susan made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked the nurses for permission to bring the baby's crib closer to William's bed, arguing that the child's presence could have a therapeutic effect that medications couldn't provide. Initially, the nurses hesitated due to the strict medical protocols of the ICU, but the supervisor, an experienced woman who had seen many cases throughout decades of work, decided to allow the approach as long as adequate hygiene precautions were taken, and the baby did not interfere with the medical equipment. Susan carefully positioned the crib next to William's bed, allowing him to feel the presence of the child, even in his unconscious state. She began to gently guide William's hands to touch the baby, constantly talking about how that child needed him, about how they formed a family that could not be broken by illness or death. William's vital signs seemed to subtly respond to the baby's presence, with small fluctuations in heart rate that the nurses noticed but could not explain medically. William, feel how your grandson is growing strong and healthy. He needs to know the grandfather who saved his life even before he was born, Susan whispered, placing William's hand on the baby's chest so he could feel the child's rhythmic breathing. During the night of the second day, Susan faced her darkest moments since William had been hospitalized, a period when the reality of the possibility of losing him became almost unbearable. The machines continued their rhythmic sounds, but William remained completely unresponsive to external stimuli, and the doctors had begun to discreetly mention that the prolonged duration of unconsciousness was not a positive sign for neurological recovery. Susan alternated between periods of intense prayer and moments of despair where she questioned if her faith was enough to produce the miracle she was asking for, if her prayers were being heard, if William really wanted to fight to come back, or if he was ready to rest in peace. During these dark hours, she talked to William about fears she had never verbalized before, the fear of raising her child alone, the fear of not being strong enough to honor the legacy of kindness that William had begun to build through her, the fear that her own life didn't have enough meaning to justify the sacrifice William had made. But each time these thoughts threatened to consume her, Susan looked at her son sleeping peacefully in the crib and found renewal of purpose in the responsibility to protect that innocent life. William, if you're listening, I need you to know that I'm not afraid to face the future alone, but I choose to face it with you by my side, because together we are stronger, she murmured, gently squeezing his hand in the darkness of the room. The third day in the ICU began with Susan feeling a spiritual urgency that she couldn't rationally explain, a sensation that the decisive moment in the fight for William's life had arrived. She had spent the night in almost continuous prayer, asking for divine guidance on how she could help William find his way back to consciousness. During the morning, Susan made a decision that was beyond anything that medical protocols or common sense could recommend. She decided to make a prayer of offering where she would place her own life in God's hands in exchange for William's recovery. This was not a decision made out of desperation or emotional impulse, but from a deep conviction that true love sometimes requires sacrifices that transcend human logic. Susan explained her intention to James when he arrived for his morning visit, and although he tried to dissuade her from thoughts he considered dangerous, she explained that it wasn't about a desire for death, but an offer of life. She was willing to accept any consequence if it meant that William would have a chance to recover and live. James, it's not about wanting to die. It's about being willing to give everything I have for the life of someone who gave everything for me and my child, explained Susan, her voice reflecting a serenity that contrasted with the intensity of her decision. The prayer that Susan made on that third day was different from all others she had offered during her life, charged with a spiritual intensity that seemed to transform the very air around William's bed. She knelt beside the bed, placing one hand on William's heart and the other on her own heart, and began to speak to God as if she were negotiating directly for William's soul. Susan offered her own life force, her future years, her capacity to love and be loved, all in exchange for a second chance for William to live and know his grandson, to enjoy the family he had found in the last months of his life. She spoke about how William had used his wealth and power to save innocent lives, when he could have simply died alone and bitter, about how he deserved the opportunity to see the fruits of his kindness, about how the world would be a better place with William in it than without him. The prayer lasted more than an hour, during which Susan experienced a state of spiritual concentration that made her completely forget the hospital environment around her, focusing all her mental and emotional energy on the connection with William and with the divine forces that could intervene on his behalf. God, I accept any suffering, any sacrifice, any consequence if it means that William can return to us. My life has value only if it can be used to protect those I love, said Susan, tears silently streaming down her face as she offered her deepest prayer. It was during the final moments of this intense prayer that something extraordinary began to happen, subtle but detectable changes in William's vital signs that made the monitoring machines emit different sounds, alerting the nurses to variations that had no obvious medical explanation. William's heart rate, which had remained consistently low and irregular for 3 days, began to show a stronger and more rhythmic pattern. His blood pressure, which had been a constant concern, began to stabilize at levels that doctors hadn't seen since before the surgery. The nurse who was monitoring the equipment immediately called the cardiologist on duty, who arrived quickly to evaluate the unexpected changes in William's condition. Susan remained in prayer, completely oblivious to the medical activities around her, focused entirely on her spiritual communication and her offer of life in exchange for William's recovery. The cardiologist examined the equipment, checked the medications being administered, and could not find a scientific explanation for the sudden and significant improvement in William's vital signs. Susan, something is happening. Mister, William's signs are improving in a way we cannot explain medically, said the nurse, gently touching Susan's shoulder to get her attention. Susan interrupted her prayer and looked at the monitoring equipment, seeing for the first time in 3 days numbers and graphs that suggested vibrant life instead of a desperate struggle for survival. She moved even closer to William's bed, observing his face for signs of consciousness, speaking to him in low and encouraging tones, asking him to fight to open his eyes and return to her and the baby who was waiting for him. The cardiologist decided to gradually reduce the sedation to see if William would respond to external stimuli, a procedure that would normally be done much more cautiously, but which the inexplicable improvements in his condition made viable. Susan held William's hand with both of her hands, constantly talking about how she and the baby needed him, about the plans they still had to make together, about how he had become the most important person in their lives. James had been called back to the hospital and arrived just as the doctors were reducing the sedation, positioning himself on the other side of the bed to offer emotional support to Susan during those crucial moments that would determine if William was really coming back to them. William, it's Susan. I'm here with our son, waiting for you to open your eyes and return to your family that loves you, said Susan, her voice laden with emotion and renewed hope. William's first signs of consciousness were subtle, a slight movement of his fingers in response to the pressure of Susan's hand, an almost imperceptible change in breathing, indicating that he was beginning to breathe more independently of the ventilator. Susan watched each small movement with complete attention, constantly talking to William, encouraging him to continue fighting to return to full consciousness. The doctors carefully monitored each change, adjusting medications and equipment as needed, but clearly impressed with the speed and completeness of William's improvement. James held the baby, bringing him closer to the bed so William could feel the presence of his grandson when he fully awoke. The tension in the room was palpable, a mixture of expectation, hope, and fear that the improvements might be temporary, or that William might wake up with neurological damage that would compromise his ability to recognize the people he loved. Susan continued talking to William about recent events, about how the baby had grown during the 3 days, about how she had remained by his side throughout the crisis, establishing a narrative bridge between the William who had fainted during the confrontation with Michael and the man who was slowly returning to consciousness. "William, you are safe now. Michael can't hurt us anymore, and we're here waiting for you to open your eyes," Susan whispered, anxiously observing for any sign of conscious response. It was during the afternoon of the 3rd day that William finally opened his eyes, a moment that Susan had imagined and prayed for during 72 hours of constant vigilance. Initially, his eyes seemed unfocused and confused, moving slowly around the room as if he were trying to process where he was and what had happened to him. Susan leaned over the bed, placing her face in William's field of vision and speaking softly to attract his attention, hoping to see recognition in his eyes when he focused on her. The cardiologist was present, checking William's pupils and performing basic neurological tests to assess his level of consciousness and brain function. James approached with the baby, ready to show William that his family was complete and safe. Susan felt her heart accelerate with anticipation and relief, preparing herself for the moment when William would speak her name and confirm that he had completely returned to them. But when William finally focused his eyes on Susan, when his vision became clear enough to see her distinctly, the expression on his face was not one of recognition or relief, but of total confusion and estrangement that made Susan's blood freeze in her veins. Who are you? Where am I? Why is this stranger here?" asked William, his voice weak but clear, looking at Susan as if she were a complete stranger who had invaded his personal space. The moment William pronounced those devastating words was as if an abyss had opened beneath Susan's feet, swallowing not only her hopes, but the entire reality she had built during the weeks of mutual care and family love they had shared. Susan felt her legs weaken and had to lean on the side of the hospital bed to avoid fainting, while processing the fact that the man who had become her family, her protector, her adoptive father, was looking at her as if she were a complete stranger who had invaded his room without permission. James observed the scene with growing horror, realizing that William's miraculous recovery had come with a cruel price that no one had anticipated. The cardiologist immediately began performing more detailed neurological tests, checking reflexes and cognitive responses to determine if the apparent amnesia was the result of brain damage caused by lack of oxygenation during the cardiac arrest or a temporary condition that could improve with time. Susan forced herself to maintain her composure in the face of the devastating situation, breathing deeply and deciding that, regardless of whether William remembered her or not, she would continue to care for him in the same way she had done during her own recovery. "William, my name is Susan. I've been taking care of you for a few weeks, and this is your grandson. We'll help you remember everything gradually," she said, her voice trembling slightly but maintaining the gentleness that had always characterized her relationship with William. William observed Susan with an expression that seemed genuinely confused, asking basic questions about where he was, what day it was, and why there was a young woman with a baby claiming a family connection with him. The cardiologist explained that William had suffered a severe heart attack and had been unconscious for 3 days, and that it was possible he was experiencing some confusion or temporary memory loss as a result of the medical trauma he had faced. Susan listened to these medical explanations with a mixture of hope and terror, hope that the amnesia would be temporary, and terror that William might never remember the love they had built together. James tried to provide supportive information, explaining to William that Susan was a very important person in his life, but William continued to look at both of them as if they were well-intentioned but fundamentally unknown strangers. During the following hours, Susan made a conscious decision not to pressure William to remember, but instead to recount their story from the beginning, as if she were meeting him for the first time, hoping that familiar details might awaken dormant memories. "William, I'm going to tell you a story about how we met. Perhaps some parts will sound familiar to you," said Susan, pulling a chair closer to the bed and beginning the narrative that she hoped could reconnect William with his recent identity. During the next few days in the hospital, Susan developed a completely new routine, based on the premise that William was, effectively, a different person who needed to be introduced to the life he had built before the heart attack. She recounted in detail how they had met, about the difficult circumstances that had led her to his mansion, about how he had taken care of her during her postpartum recovery, and about how a relationship of mutual care had developed into a genuine family connection. William listened to these stories with polite but distant attention, occasionally asking questions about specific details, but never showing the kind of emotional recognition that Susan secretly hoped to see in his eyes. Susan also spent hours showing photographs that James had brought from the mansion, images of the library that William loved, of the gardens he personally tended to, of moments they had shared during their weeks living together. Even more painful was watching William interact with the baby, treating the child with polite kindness, but without any sign of the special grandfather connection he had developed before the heart attack. Susan forced herself to maintain a positive and patient attitude, but internally struggled against the despair of having lost not just William, but the entire family she had found through him. "William, you always said that family isn't about blood, but about choice and love. Even if you don't remember now, I choose to continue being your family," said Susan, holding his hand, while he observed the baby with polite but distant curiosity. What Susan didn't know was that William had fully recovered his memory on the second day after waking up, but had made the conscious decision to continue pretending to have amnesia as a way to test whether Susan's care and love for him were genuine or motivated by interest in the inheritance and financial security he had promised. William had spent decades being surrounded by people whose affection was directly proportional to his wealth, and even after all the experiences he had shared with Susan, a small part of his mind still questioned whether she would remain by his side if he were just a sick man with no resources to offer. During the days of testing, William carefully observed each of Susan's gestures, each word of encouragement, each moment of care, looking for signs of impatience, frustration, or calculated interest that might reveal hidden motivations. But what he observed day after day was a dedication that went far beyond any obligation or interest, a love that seemed to grow even in the face of the apparent loss of everything Susan had gained through her connection with him. William saw how Susan cared for him even when he was just a confused stranger, how she talked about their future plans, even without guarantees that he would remember her, how she treated each small improvement in his condition as a personal victory, even without receiving emotional recognition in return. "This woman is caring for me as if I were truly her father, even thinking I've lost all memories of our connection. This is real love, not interest," thought William, watching Susan read to him in the same way she had done during her own recovery. During the fourth day in the hospital, Susan faced her first major crisis of faith since William had awakened without memories, a moment when the reality of potentially having forever lost the family connection that had become the center of her new identity almost made her completely fall apart. James found her crying silently in the hospital chapel, holding the baby and questioning whether she had been selfish in praying for William's life, when perhaps it would have been better for him to have passed away peacefully, without having to face the confusion and disorientation of not remembering his own life. Susan expressed her doubts about whether she was doing the right thing by continuing to care for William, when he clearly felt no emotional connection to her, about whether it wouldn't be more honest to simply ensure he received adequate medical care and then step away from his life to allow him to build new relationships based on his current identity. James offered wise perspectives based on decades of observing William, reminding Susan that true love sometimes requires sacrifices that don't bring immediate rewards, and that her constant presence might be exactly what William needed to find his way back to the person he had become through her influence. They talked about faith, about purpose, about how sometimes the greatest demonstrations of love are those that nobody witnesses or acknowledges, and Susan found renewed determination to continue caring for William, regardless of whether he would ever remember who she was. "James, even if William never remembers me, he taught me that family means being present when someone needs you, regardless of recognition or reward," said Susan, wiping away her tears and returning to William's room with renewed determination. William had heard part of this conversation between Susan and James, having discreetly followed her to the chapel, when he noticed that Susan had disappeared from the hospital room for a longer period than usual. The words she had spoken about family, about being present without expectation of recognition, about choosing to love even when that love wasn't reciprocated or remembered, touched William in a way that definitively confirmed that his suspicions about Susan's character were correct. He quickly returned to the room before Susan and James came back, and during the following hours, observed with growing admiration how Susan had transformed her crisis of faith into an even greater determination to care for him without expecting anything in return. William saw how she reorganized her own feelings of loss and disappointment to focus entirely on his medical and emotional needs, how she found genuine joy in small improvements in his physical condition even when he continued to treat her as a kind stranger. During a particularly touching conversation, Susan told William about her own mother, about how she had learned that loving someone sometimes means silently carrying pain so that the other person can find peace, and about how caring for William had become a way to honor her mother's memory and the values she had taught. William was deeply moved by the emotional depth and spiritual maturity that Susan demonstrated, qualities that he recognized as being even more developed than they were before his heart attack. Susan is loving me in the purest way possible, without expectations, without conditions, simply because she chooses to do so. This is the real family I've always searched for, thought William, watching Susan cradle his son while singing lullabies she had learned from her own mother. On the 5th day in the hospital, William finally made the decision to reveal that his memory had fully returned, but chose to do it in a way that honored the extraordinary dedication Susan had demonstrated during the difficult days of apparent amnesia. During the afternoon, when Susan was reading to him from one of the poetry books from his personal library, William gently interrupted her reading and asked her to sit closer to the bed because he had something important to share with her. Susan immediately became concerned, thinking that William might be experiencing pain or discomfort, but he reassured her and began to talk about how the stories she had told during the past few days had awakened not just memories, but a deeper understanding about the meaning of family and unconditional love. William began to recite specific details of their shared experiences that Susan had never mentioned during her narratives, intimate details about conversations they had had, about special moments they had shared, about feelings he had experienced during her recovery. Gradually, Susan began to realize that William was remembering much more than should be possible, based solely on the stories she had told, and a cautious hope began to grow in her heart. William then took her hand and gently explained that his memory had fully returned on the 2nd day, but that he had chosen to test if her love was genuine or based on gratitude and financial interest. "Susan, I need to ask for your forgiveness for this test, but I needed to be certain that the love between us was real. Now I know without any doubt that you love me as a father and I love you as a daughter, regardless of circumstances or benefits," said William, tears running down his face as he finally allowed his true emotions to show. Susan's initial reaction to William's revelation was a complex mixture of relief, joy, and a slight justifiable irritation at having been tested in such an elaborate way during an already emotionally difficult period. She expressed her happiness at having William back completely, but also her frustration at having spent days questioning her own sanity and worth as a person while he secretly observed her efforts to reconnect them. William completely accepted her irritation as fair and explained his motivations with genuine humility, acknowledging that he had been selfish in putting her through such a rigorous emotional test, but also expressing gratitude for the way she had passed the test in a manner that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Susan, in turn, recognized that she understood William's insecurities about relationships based on financial interest, and that her own experiences with Michael had taught her that sometimes people do hurtful things out of fear of being hurt again. They spent hours talking about trust, about family, about how their individual experiences of betrayal and abandonment had made them cautious, but also about how they had found in their connection a form of love that transcended their past wounds. James, who had returned to the room during part of this conversation, observed with paternal satisfaction the reconciliation between two people who had become the family he had always wished William would find. "William, I promise I will forgive your test, but only if you promise never again to doubt my love for our family," said Susan, embracing William for the first time since he had awakened, feeling as if she were recovering a part of herself that had been lost. William's physical recovery progressed rapidly during the following weeks, driven not only by the excellent medical care he received, but by the renewal of purpose and joy he found in having his family back and knowing that his connection with Susan was based on genuine love. During the rehabilitation period, William and Susan spent time planning the future, discussing how to legally formalize their family relationship and making decisions about how to structure financial and legal matters to ensure that Susan and the baby would be protected, regardless of what happened with William's health in the future. William also shared with Susan his expanded plans to use his wealth meaningfully, including establishing foundations to help women in situations similar to what Susan had faced, creating a legacy that would honor not only his memory, but the values that Susan had helped him rediscover. Susan contributed ideas based on her own experience, suggesting programs that could provide not only financial assistance, but educational and emotional support for women trying to rebuild their lives after abusive relationships or situations of exploitation. They also discussed plans for the baby, including education, values they wanted to pass on, and how to ensure that the child would grow up understanding both the privileges and responsibilities that would come with the inheritance William was leaving. "Susan, I want our family to be an example of how wealth can be used to create opportunities and hope for others facing difficulties similar to those you faced," said William, reviewing legal documents that would establish not only Susan and the baby's inheritance, but also the philanthropic funds they would implement together. After the heart attack that had nearly cost William his life, he was completely physically recovered and emotionally stronger than he had been in decades, transformed by the experience of almost losing everything and by discovering that he had found a family who loved him regardless of his wealth or status. The recovery had been accompanied by a surprising improvement even in his cancer condition, with doctors reporting that the tumors had stabilized and that he could expect much more quality time than anyone had initially anticipated. Susan had fully established herself as William's adopted daughter and as administrator of many of his philanthropic businesses, proving to have a natural aptitude for financial management and a genuine passion for helping other people in vulnerable situations. The baby, now almost a year old, had become the center of joy for the entire household, giving William the experience of being a grandfather that he had never imagined he would have. During these 6 months, Michael had tried several times to re-establish contact with Susan, initially through apologies and promises of change, then through legal threats about parental rights, and finally through extortion attempts based on threats of public exposure that he thought could damage William's reputation. Each of these attempts had been systematically documented by William's lawyers and had resulted in legal evidence that would eventually lead to Michael's arrest for attempted extortion, harassment, and other charges related to his blackmail attempts. "Susan, today we're going to legally formalize what we already know in our hearts, that we are a true family, united not by chance or necessity, but by choice and genuine love," said William, preparing to leave for the registry office where they would finalize all the legal documents. The trip to the notary's office represented the culmination of an extraordinary journey that had begun with desperation and a commercial transaction, but had transformed into one of the most authentic family connections that any of those involved had experienced. William had meticulously prepared all the necessary documents to officially make Susan his legal adopted daughter, establish the baby as his official grandson, and create a complex legal structure that would ensure they inherited not only his wealth, but also the responsibility of continuing the philanthropic work they had begun together. Susan wore a simple yet elegant blue dress that William had purchased specifically for the occasion, carrying the baby who was dressed in clothes that made him look like a little prince, all representing the complete opposite of the desperate and impoverished family that had arrived at William's mansion almost a year before. James accompanied them to the notary's office, serving as an official witness and as the only person besides them who had witnessed the entire journey from the beginning to that moment of legal and emotional triumph. The process of signing the documents was both formal and deeply emotional, with each signature representing not just a legal formality, but an affirmation of family commitments that transcended any document or law. When the notary finally proclaimed that Susan was officially William's adopted daughter and that the baby was legally his grandson, All three adults present shed tears of joy and relief for having reached that moment through so many difficulties and uncertainties. "Susan, now it's official. You are my daughter in every legal and emotional sense, and your son is my beloved grandson. Our family was built through choices, not accident," said William, embracing Susan and the baby after signing the final documents. The celebration after the legal formalization was intimate, but meaningful. Held in William's library where so many of their important conversations had taken place, with James preparing a special dinner and even a small ceremony where William officially welcomed Susan and the baby as permanent members of the family. During the celebration, William presented Susan with a family ring that had belonged to his mother, a tangible symbol of his complete acceptance of her as a daughter, and also officially established an educational trust fund for the baby that would ensure the child had access to the best educational opportunities available. Susan, in turn, presented William with a photo album she had secretly compiled during the months of recovery, documenting special moments they had shared and creating a visual record of how their family had grown and developed. The baby, now old enough to participate in the celebration in a limited way, provided entertainment and joy for everyone present, demonstrating the cheerful and curious personality that promised to bring continued happiness to his new family. James toasted the family, expressing his gratitude for having witnessed William's transformation from a lonely and bitter man into a loving father and grandfather, and his admiration for the strength and kindness that Susan had demonstrated throughout the difficult journey that had led them to that moment of triumph. The night was filled with stories, laughter, plans for the future, and a sense of family completeness that none of them had experienced before finding each other through circumstances that initially seemed desperate. "This house has finally become a true home, filled with the love and laughter of a real family," said William, watching Susan teach the baby to clap his hands while James wiped away tears of joy. In the months following the legal formalization, the lives of William, Susan, and the baby settled into a routine of domestic happiness that none of them had imagined possible during the dark days they had faced before becoming a family. William had found in adoptive fatherhood and the experience of being a grandfather a source of joy and purpose that gave meaning to each day of life he had left, regardless of how long that might be. Each morning brought new precious moments. The baby babbling his first attempts at words, Susan singing lullabies that echoed through the mansion, and he himself discovering a patience and tenderness he never knew he possessed. Susan had discovered that her experience of nearly losing everything had made her stronger and more capable of appreciating the security and love she now had, and had dedicated herself not only to caring for her family, but to the philanthropic work that allowed her to help other women in situations similar to her own past experience. She had established a mentoring program where she shared her story of overcoming, offering practical hope for single mothers and women escaping abusive relationships. The baby was growing in an environment of unconditional love and unlimited opportunities, but was also being raised with solid values about social responsibility and the importance of using privileges to help those facing difficulties. William made sure that his grandson understood from an early age that wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege. James had become not only the house manager, but a beloved avuncular figure who provided continuity and wisdom for the whole family, often telling stories from William's youth that revealed the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in the man who now served with renewed dedication. Michael, meanwhile, had faced the full consequences of his selfish choices. He had been prosecuted for attempted extortion and other crimes related to his blackmail attempts, had lost all legal rights related to the baby due to evidence that he had tried to sell his family, and was facing a prison sentence that would keep him away from Susan and the baby for the foreseeable future. The justice Michael faced was not vindictive, but simply the natural consequence of choices that had placed his own greed above his family's welfare. Michael chose to sell his family for money, and now he has discovered that some transactions have permanent consequences that cannot be undone with late regret, observed William, reading a letter from the lawyer confirming Michael's final sentence. 2 years after legal formalization, the mansion had become the center of a foundation that helped hundreds of women in vulnerable situations. The garden that William once tended alone now echoed with his grandson's laughter, who at 2 years old ran among the flowers with tireless energy. Susan had become a respected leader in the community, known for her ability to understand the needs of families in crisis. William, at 67, was healthier than he had been in decades, with doctors attributing his recovery to renewed purpose and family joy. "Grandpa William, look how I can run to that tree," shouted the little one, who already demonstrated curious intelligence. James observed with satisfaction how the house finally pulsed with family life. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, where William read stories to his grandson while Susan reviewed correspondence from the foundation. Afternoons were dedicated to charitable work, with Susan visiting families helped by the programs. Evenings were reserved for dining together and time in the garden, where William taught about plants and James shared stories that made everyone laugh. "Susan, when I look at our family, I realize that my life really began when you arrived," said William, watching his grandson play. The family foundation had become respected for its approach that included psychological, educational, and legal support. Susan personally accompanied more than 50 families, using her experience to offer hope. William established university scholarships for beneficiaries' children, ensuring educational opportunities. The work attracted national attention, with organizations seeking to learn their innovative methods. Each family helped became part of a support network that continued to grow. "We discovered that the best way to heal our wounds is to help heal those of others," noted Susan. Michael remained in prison, serving his sentence for extortion and blackmail. His attempts at contact through letters were ignored by Susan, who preferred to focus on the family she had built. The lawyers ensured he would never have rights over his grandson, due to evidence of having tried to sell his family. His absence allowed Susan to live in complete peace, without fear of interference. For her, Michael had become simply an overcome memory. "Michael chose to destroy our family out of greed, but he led me to a true family where I am loved," reflected Susan. The future stretched out with unlimited possibilities. William created a will ensuring the continuity of wealth and perpetuity of the foundation. Susan planned to pursue graduate studies in social work, while William dreamed of seeing his grandson grow up and take leadership of the foundation. James was included in the will with a generous pension, although he insisted on continuing to work. Everyone learned that real wealth was in family connections and positive impact on others' lives. "Our family proves that miracles happen when people choose to love unconditionally," said William, embracing Susan and his grandson in the garden where his journey of redemption had begun. Did you like Susan and William's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.